Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to start talking about the costs of production. Actually, we're going to get into some of the details of the costs of production. And we're going to talk about how we measure all the different types of costs that are faced on a firm. Now, on a previous podcast, we talked a little bit about the fixed and variable inputs, and then we said from that we could begin to think about the idea of fixed and variable costs. So we went from fixed and variable inputs to thinking about fixed and variable costs. So in this video, we're going to talk about how we measure those different types of fixed and variable costs. So let's start over here. These are some basic formulas that we're going to look at. So we start with Q. Now let's talk about Q for a little bit. First of all, I should not use an uppercase Q anymore. We've used Q to talk about the quantity of a good. When we did like supply and demand and things like that, we talked about Q as in terms of the quantity. But now that was Q looking at the entire market. We're now going to look at the output. This Q that we're going to look at is going to be the quantity for the individual firm. So no longer do we want to look at an uppercase Q for the individual firm. We're going to use a lowercase q. We're going to use a lowercase q. So a lowercase q means that we're talking about the quantity or the output or the production of an individual firm. So sometimes that'll be called Q, lowercase q. Sometimes we'll call it TP for total product. And this is information typically that an instructor would give to you. So they would say, what happens if you produce 0 units of a good, 1 unit of a good, 2 units of a good, 3 units of a good, and so on it would go. And now we start looking at, for each level of production, we want to look at our different costs. So you're going to have total fixed costs and total variable costs. Now, this gets back to that distinction between between fixed and variable. A fixed cost is a cost that's going to stay the same no matter what your level of production. So it's going to be the same over different levels of production, different levels of Q. So we increase output and the fixed costs are going to stay the same. And then the variable costs, total variable costs, these are going to vary. They are not going to stay the same. They are going to change over different levels of production. They're going to change over different levels of Q. They're going to change when we alter production here. That's supposed to be a Q. When we change production, our variable costs are going to change. So we're going to have fixed costs and we're going to have variable costs. Now, from there, we can calculate all the other things that are here. All the other things are here. So the next one that we're going to look at would be your total costs. So total costs is just a simple formula. Your total costs are the total fixed costs, which you would get from here, plus the total variable costs. So if you were producing at 2 levels of output, you would take your fixed costs at that level of output and add your variable costs at that level of output, and that would give you your total costs at that level of output. So it's your fixed costs plus your variable costs. All right, the A in the next couple formulas, the A means average. So now we're going to look at, we have the total fixed cost, the total variable cost, the total cost, which we can calculate, and now we're going to calculate the average fixed cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. So let's just go ahead and look at the formulas for these. The average fixed cost is going to be the total fixed cost, that's going to be your total fixed cost at some level of production, divided by that level of production. So if you produce at 2 units, your total fixed cost, your average fixed cost is going to be your total fixed cost at that level of production, divided by the number of units you produce, which in this case was 2, and that would give you your average fixed cost. Well, we will look at this with numbers in a video shortly, so we'll come back to that. Right now, I just want to give you the formulas. The average variable cost is the total variable cost divided by the level of production. So if you produce at 2 units, you would take whatever your total variable costs are, divided by the level of production, and then that would give you your average variable cost at that level of production. And then your average total cost is just taking your total cost divided by your level of production. So most people are pretty okay with these, maybe need a little practice, but not too bad. This is the one that's going to confuse people, and that is your marginal cost. The marginal cost is the change in the total cost. That is, when you alter production, it's the change in the total cost divided by the change in Q, divided by the change in Q. And this change in Q, this is often going to be 1. This change in Q is often going to be 1. I don't want to say it's always going to be, but it's often going to be, because we would ask the question, what would happen if I increased production from 1 unit to 2 units? And then if I did that, I would say, what was the change in the total cost when I increased production from 1 to 2? What was the change in the total cost divided by the change in output? And if my output went from 1 to 2, then the change in output would just be equal to 1, would be equal to 1. So the marginal cost is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Now, let's look at this with numbers. So what I did here was I give you the total product, which is also the Q. So this is the different levels of output for the firm. They could produce 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10 units. And then notice the fixed cost for the firm is the same. That's what makes it a fixed cost. No matter what your level of production is, you're going to face this fixed cost of $50. Maybe that's maybe you have to pay I don't know, some sort of a rental contract. Maybe you're going to rent the rights to something, or you're going to rent a warehouse or whatever it is, and maybe that costs you $50 a week, and you wrote a contract for, you have a 5-year contract on that rental property at $50 per week. So that 50 is now fixed. You can't change it over the next 5 years. That would be a fixed cost if you have a 5-year contract. And then your variable costs, these would be costs that can be varied. This is like paying the electricity, paying workers, because you can if you increase production, you can use more electricity pretty easily. You can hire more workers and so on. So those are the variable costs. Now from there, and what you can do is you can just pause the video and go back and calculate all of these other costs. Use the total fixed and the total variable, and use that to calculate your total cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, and marginal cost. So what I would do is what you should do is you should pause the video at this point and try to calculate all of those, make sure that you can do it, and then come back and look at the actual numbers, and I'll show you the actual numbers in terms of the answers. Let me show you this again. So here you are, total fixed cost, total variable cost. So do the calculations, just pause it, and then just come back and check it. All right, so let's look at these. Let's look at these other numbers. So this would be your total costs, and let's just pick a level of production, and I'll just kind of go through the calculations very quickly. If we produced, or if we were calculating all of these numbers at a level of 5 units of production, my fixed cost would be 50. My total variable cost, say, would be 210. And by the way, these are costs that typically, they're given to you. You can find them very easily. If you produce 5 units, it costs the firm $50 of fixed cost and $210 of variable cost. You then calculate the total cost, which would be the fixed cost plus the variable cost, would give you the total cost. And then you calculate your average fixed cost, where your average fixed cost would be 50 divided by 5, right? It'd be 50, which would be your total fixed cost, divided by 5, which is that level of output. That gives you 10. And of course, you got to do that for every single one of these. And then your average variable cost would be the variable cost, which was $210, divided by your level of output, which is 5, and that would give you an average variable cost of 42. And then if we look at the average total cost, that's going to be the total cost, which is 260, divided by our level of production, which is 5. So if we produce 5 units, our our average total cost is going to be 52. And then finally, we have the marginal cost. And the marginal cost, when we increase production by 1, when we go from 4 units of production to 5 units of production, my total costs went up from 210 to 260. So my total cost increased by 50. So my marginal cost would be the change in the total cost, which was 50. That was right here, change in the total cost, divided by my change in output, which was 1, and that would give you your marginal cost. Okay, so that's how you do these calculations, and you want to check, make sure you did these calculations correct for all of these. And of course, once you can do these calculations, then in the real world, we don't sit around and do those anymore. We write all of these formulas into a spreadsheet, and then all we got to do is put in our fixed costs and our variable costs, and the spreadsheet would take care of everything else. Okay, so thanks for joining me for this video. In the next upcoming videos, we're going to look at the graphs of these numbers. We're going to look at the graphs of the total costs and then the average costs and marginal costs. We're going to look at those on a future video. All right, so thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast, and we'll see you on the next podcast.